some logistics and logistics I'd like to start with, and then I'd like to get settled into the material for the day and continue to try to engage you in this topic and persuade you as to why it's relevant to your lives and actually to your intellectual interests. So first, this is Sam Southgate. He's the head TF, and he wants to talk to you a little bit about sectioning.
Okay. Yeah, hi everyone. As you probably know, section's open tomorrow. Due to the demand that there has been for the course so far, we've taken on extra TF, and we're hoping that we'll have more than enough sections such that everyone here can take the class, and other people who aren't here right now can take the class. We're going to have them Monday through Thursday at times throughout the day. So they'll be open at 9 a.m. tomorrow. If you can't get into a section that fits into your schedule tomorrow, then please put yourself on the wait list for a section that does work for you, and we'll try to work things out, add another section perhaps, or switch things around a little bit to make sure everyone can be accommodated. Yeah, a few other announcements I just wanted to make is that PDFs of Professor Christakis' slides will be on Classes V2. We're not going to be uploading them in advance or even after every lecture, but in kind of bunches of 3, 4, or 5 every week or week and a half after the lectures. We're also putting videos of the lectures on Classes V2 in the media gallery section. If you miss a lecture for some reason, or you just want to go and review something from that lecture, they're available there. Next, TF office hours will begin next week. Sections don't actually start until the 3rd week of classes, which is January 27th. But if you want to speak to the TF of the section you're in, or you want to speak to me as head TF, you're very welcome to make an appointment beginning next week. And those are all online sign-up via Classes V2, the sign-up tool on there. And we're very happy to chat with you. And if anyone has any questions or issues related to the course logistically or administratively, then grab me after lecture today, or alternatively send me an email, and I'll do my very best to help you.
Thank you so much, Sam. Thank you. We're totally committed to making room for anyone who wants to take the class. We'll expand the number of sections or the time, so you should not be disappointed. We can't promise to give you your first choice section time, but I want to assure you that we will do whatever we can to make sure that inability to section does not prevent you from taking the class. A couple of things. So the podcasting was mentioned, the slide availability. Take a look at the exam dates on the syllabus. Today, it'll be hard for me to be sympathetic if in a month you discover that the exam dates conflict with some burning personal obligation. So if there's a personal obligation that you can foresee now that creates a conflict, now's the time to tell me, not later on. All right. So I want to stress that this class is broadly synthetic of the social and natural sciences and medicine in particular, and that it is both quantitative and qualitative in nature. And it will involve occasional allusions to biological and medical concepts and may involve some simple math, but much of this stuff is at the beginning of the class, and in any case, I have no doubt you can handle it. So do not be frightened away if in the first few classes there seems to be a bit more biology. Actually, we'll have more biology. One lecture towards the end of the class, we're going to talk a little bit about how social factors can literally get under our skin and affect the regulation of our genome. But by and large, no prerequisites, not by and large, in fact, there are no prerequisites for the class. So last week we covered a number of topics. Using suicide as an initial example, we contrasted personal and collective ways of studying illness, medicine, and death. And we talked about different ways, more generally, of understanding social phenomena. We introduced the concept of methodologic individualism and methodological holism, for example. And we described ways that the practice of medicine differs from the practice of public health. And we saw that human lifespans have increased dramatically in the last 100 years. In the United States in particular, going from 48 years average life expectancy at birth in men to 80 years just in the last century. And this, in fact, has been an amazing achievement. If you want to think about it just from kind of an object of human endeavor, something we wish to do, the fact that we have been able to make our own species this much longer is nothing short, in my mind, of astonishing. And it's been unmatched. There's been no other kind of increase in well-being that has matched that, at least in my opinion. We were also introduced last week, or at the introductory lecture, to the social patterning of longevity and causes of death. we looked at some of the factors that sort of indicate or help determine, or stratify at least, the determinants of survival and illness in human populations. And how long you live and what you die of appears to vary not only across time, but also across socioeconomic attributes. And we introduced some of the other phenomena that we'll be considering in this class, such as neighborhood effects, institutional effects, and network effects on health. Now, in this class, we're going to be engaging the implications of structural opportunities for individuals. And this is a long-standing debate in the social sciences. Does your fate depend on your own choices and actions, or does your fate depend on the choices and actions of others, or the structural factors that surround you? This is the tension or the difference between structure and agency. Both, of course, are important, but the extent to which each is important in any particular outcome is often contested, both philosophically and theoretically, and empirically and pragmatically. So in the case of health, the questions become quite important. What determines health? Is it individuals or the environment? And who is responsible? And these questions, in turn, raise obvious moral and policy questions. Now, behind these questions is the issue of whether medical care really makes any difference at all. Consider this, for example. The United States spends more on health care than any other country, but it does not have the best outcomes by any means. For example, we spend an average of $5,274 per capita, and the British spend $2,164 per capita, and they live longer and have fewer medical problems, even accounting for race and age. So just to give you a feel for what an outlier the United States is, take a look at this graph. One of these is not like the others. So here's the United States over here, and so here on the x-axis we have health spending per capita in US dollars with purchasing power parity. Here on the y-axis we have life expectancy in years. Here's the United States. So we spend more by far than anyone else, but we are not near the top here on the y-axis. In fact, we live about as long as the Brits, but we spend more than twice as much as the Brits. And then you can also compare the Brits to the Japanese. They spend about the same amount per capita, but the Japanese live yet again longer than the Brits. So understanding the sources of these differences, how we might explain these differences across countries, one of the topics that we will be engaging. Now, one of the arguments we'll be making is that while biomedical care might be effective in acute inpatient settings, and while it might make some difference in the kind of survival of patients who are acutely ill or are hospitalized, in chronic disease and in outpatient settings, biomedical care is much less relevant and much less important. Thus, a focus on access to health care ignores the most important determinant of health, namely the patient's sociocultural context. And this can in turn lead to a host of misguided policies. To improve the health in the population, in fact, physicians, in my judgment, must serve as advocates for improved social conditions, for improved or better public health initiatives, for general or health education, and for behavioral interventions. Now, as we introduced last time, life expectancy has changed a lot in the last 100 years. So just to recapitulate, here on the y-axis is a year in the last century. On the x-axis is life expectancy. This is in the United States. And about 100 years ago, if you were born and you were a man, in yellow, you might expect to live about 48 years. And now that's grown to be about 76 years. And for women always were lucky in this regard. Women always have fared better than men when it comes to longevity. But they too have benefited from improvements in the last century, actually somewhat more than men, in fact. Now, if you survived to be 65, however, 100 years ago, you might expect to live, whether you are a man or a woman, about 12 years. And survival at age 65 has also increased, again, more for women than for men. But this improvement from here to here is not absolutely as much as this improvement from there to there. Here we're gaining about 25 or 30 years. Here we're gaining about 6 or 8 years. So actually these improvements in life expectancy that we've seen in the last century have arisen primarily from the conquest of things that kill people in early age. We have mastered or stopped early killers, and that's what's prolonging survival. If you survived that 100 years ago and lived to be 65, your survival was about 10 or 12 years. That too has improved in the last century, but not as much. And this increase in life expectancy or this decrease in mortality, is actually part of a larger phenomenon known as the health transition, and was described in 1971 by Abdel Amran. And I'm going to spend about 5 minutes introducing the health transition because it sets a stage for certain other topics we're going to be discussing in the early part of the class. And in fact, to understand the health transition, we need long data and not just big data. So the conventional perspective on the health transition gives it 4 stages that are related to the socioeconomic development and disease patterns in a country. So here on the x-axis, we have a year. It's sort of arbitrary. This could be 50 years or 400-year time period. And on the x-axis here, we're plotting the crude birth rate in blue, the crude death rate in red per 1,000 people. So this is how many babies are born and how many people are dying per capita. And here on the y-axis in black, we're plotting the total population. And there are 4 stages through which industrializing societies move from the kind of prehistorical period to a kind of contemporary period. And it's been very interesting to try to understand this transition, this improvement in human well-being over the last few hundred years. So, and these stages are typical of a fully developed country today, such as the United States or Canada, or countries in Europe, or similar societies elsewhere, such as Japan or Australia. And stage 1, shown on the far left, pertains to pre-modern times. And this stage is characterized by a balance between births and deaths. So the crude death rate in red and the crude birth rate in blue are roughly the same across time. And as a result, population size is constant, or rising ever so slowly. There's a balance between births and deaths in our species, and the population of our species isn't changing very much in this period of time. And so at this period of time, births and deaths were high, a lot of babies born, a lot of people dying, about 30 to 50 per 1,000. And because they were roughly in balance, there was extremely slow population growth. And in fact, for much of our history, at least since the agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago, population growth has been so slow that we've had growth rates on the order of 0.05%, meaning that they've been doubling times to human populations on the order of 1,000 to 5,000 years. Whereas even during your lifetime, the population has doubled on our planet. So for centuries, millennia, the human population was very stable. And the world you live in today is actually than a kind of normal state of affairs. This is known as the high stationary phase of population growth because there's high birth and death rates and stationary in terms of the population. And death rates were high at all times in this stage for a number of reasons. And these reasons included lack of knowledge of disease prevention and cure, occasional food shortages and famines that would wipe people out, and the impact of all kinds of extrinsic causes of death in accidents and diseases. So here we have so socioeconomic development is not really present. It's very minimal. You know, we're past the Pleistocene, so we're after the invention of agriculture in cities, so you might give it a plus instead of a 0. Life expectancy at birth is about 30 years, and the things that kill people are generally acute, or affect people and kill them, are acute, infectious, and nutritional conditions. But then something starts to happen in phase 2 of the health transition. Industrialization begins. And there's a rise in population that's caused by a decline in the death rate. So during this time period, the death rate in red begins to fall dramatically. The birth rate is falling slightly, and we'll come back to that, but it's lagging. So the death rate is falling dramatically, and population begins to rise in this over time period. Incidentally, other countries like Singapore, Korea, and Taiwan have followed the same kind of trajectory over much more compressed time frames than the longer time frames that have characterized European development. And this decline in death rates is initially due to 2 factors. First, there are improvements in food supply and agricultural practices beginning around the 18th century, things like crop rotation and selective breeding, seed technology. And another food-related factor was the introduction into Europe of New World things like potatoes and corn. And these new crops increase the quantity of foodstuffs in the European diet, and especially in Northern Europe. And the second big thing was that there were significant improvements in public health that reduced mortality, particularly in childhood. So there were not many medical breakthroughs during this period. It wasn't that doctors had discovered ways to stop people from dying. Rather, all kinds of other things were happening that were reducing the death rate during these periods. So things like improvements in the water supply, sewage and food handling, or general personal hygiene following from a growth in scientific knowledge. Also, increased female literacy was playing a role, allied with public health intervention. Now, as a consequence of the decline in mortality in stage 2, there was, as I already mentioned, an increase in the population growth. And this growth was not due to more babies being born. It was due to fewer people dying. And another characteristic of stage 2 of the demographic or health transition is a change in the age structure of the population. So in stage 1, the majority of deaths were concentrated in the first 5 years of life. Therefore, more than anything else, the decline in death rates in stage 2 entails increasing survival of children, and hence the age structure of the population becomes increasingly youthful. So if you look at the distribution of ages in the population in stage 1 versus stage 2, it's very different. Many more young people beginning in stage 2. Stage 3 begins to move the population towards stability through a decline in birth rates. So what's happening in stage 3 is the birth rates now are falling. Here in blue, begin to fall. So death rates fall in stage 2. Now birth rates fall in stage 3 and are converging here to a new equilibrium, which is stage 4. Population now is rising very dramatically. And these decline in birth rates is not fully understood, but it's thought to be due to a number of phenomena. First, in rural areas, people began to see that more and more children were surviving, and they decided to have fewer and fewer children because they no longer needed them to take care of them in old age. Parents realized that they did not require so many children to be born in order to themselves be comfortable in their own old age. Also, there was increasing urbanization and changes in traditional values that sort of decreased the emphasis on fertility. People began to assess more rationally just how many children they desired or needed. And there were all kinds of other laws, especially in England, that were passed that sort of decreased the utility, like child labor laws, that made it not so beneficial, let's say, to have a large labor supply in your own household. Also, increasing female literacy played a role as women became more and more able to assert themselves in the home and take more control over their own reproduction. And late, of course, in the 20th century, we have the introduction of contraception, which, of course, contributes to this transition in contemporary countries that are undergoing a kind of health transition. So eventually, fertility falls to replacement levels. And finally, we have stage 4, where population is sort of, again, where births and deaths are roughly in equilibrium. And population is also sort of stationary, rising gently, not quite as flat as here, but nowhere near as explosive as in stage 3. And here in stage 2, socioeconomic development is, let's say, 2+. Life expectancy at birth has increased to 30 to 50. Here it's gone up a bit more. Now the diseases that are beginning to affect people are chronic diseases. And finally, we're getting to stage 4, which is characterized by stability as well. And in this phase, age structure in the population gets older as well. But there might be other demographic changes, including a change in disability rates or quality of life, or even in the gender basis of the society, applying technologies to abort female fetuses preferentially. So even though we've achieved a kind of a new equilibrium demographically speaking, it doesn't preclude other kinds of macro trends happening. Maybe people are more disabled. Maybe people are aborting female fetuses, for example, as in India or China. So other kinds of things could be happening. It's not like it's fixed at that point forward. And I seriously doubt myself that there will be what some have argued might be a 5th stage or an age of immortality. Though we'll see at the end of the class, we'll come back to a kind of some sort of cyborg arguments about a sort of a human-machine fusion that might extend our lives so much that we might have another kind of transition in these types of phenomena that we've been seeing. And the 4th stage really does involve a delay in disease and certain other features, including possibly an increase in mental illness and in a phenomenon known as medicalization, which we'll come back to in a moment. So in summary, as socioeconomic development proceeds, mortality and fertility rates shift from high to low rates, populations get larger and older, and the disease patterns shift from one dominated by infectious diseases, perinatal diseases, and nutritional disorders, to one dominated by chronic diseases and mental disorders. And this increase in life expectancy is mirrored by a changing composition in the causes of death. So it's not just that we're living longer, we're dying of different things. So here is the percent of all deaths. These data are a bit old, but it's tell the story adequately. Infectious diseases are dropping dramatically. Cardiovascular diseases are expanding. Violence is shown here, roughly constant in this time period, and so forth. Cancer is increasing, and all others are, of course, decreasing. So people are living longer. They're dying of different things. But the question is, are we better for it? And this is an important question we haven't yet considered. If I told you that you could live to be 70 and then drop dead, or live to be 70 and then spend 5 more years in a coma or in agony, and then die at 75, which would you prefer? Most people would prefer the former, not the latter. Although in every year there's always someone who says, give me the 5 years of agony. I don't know what they're thinking. But, and the question is, would that be an improvement? If we were extending life, but not improving the quality of life, would we have improved the utility or the well-being of the society? So the question is, are we living better when we live longer? And this was discussed in one of the readings for today in the Fries paper. This is a classic paper in 1980. Fries outlined 3 possibilities. So one possibility, so here's the present morbidity pattern. So people, let's say, live to be 55. Then they're afflicted with morbidity. Morbidity means illness. Mortality means death. They have morbidity starts, and then their morbidity increases, and then they die at the age of 76. If we have life extension, it means that the morbidity still begins at 55, but people just live longer. So we're tacking on 4 years of life, but during those 4 years, people are in terrible shape. It's unclear whether that's such a good thing. Maybe it is. Or we could have a shift to the right, where we shift the onset of morbidity by 5 years and death by 5 years. So we have the same amount of morbidity as before, but now more life, longer life. So this dominates, this one clearly dominates that. Same total morbidity, but you live a longer life. Or you could have what Fries called a compression of morbidity, where you have a shift in the onset of morbidity, let's say from 55 to 65, and a lengthening of life, but not a proportionate increase, not like this situation. So people are shifted forward in the onset of morbidity, shifted forward towards that direction in when they die, but they spend less time, total time, ill. The compression of morbidity is good in and of itself, but it also has policy benefits in that it offsets the effects of population aging and offsets the consequences of an increasing number of elderly who need medical care. So if you're having older people, but they're not as sick while they're old, it has significant implications for how we allocate resources and how costly it is to care for people with that age structure. And Cutler, also in your readings for today, notes that over the last few decades, life expectancy and the number of elderly in our society have greatly increased, but the number of nursing homes has remained constant or declined. So this is indirect evidence for the compression hypothesis. Now, when Fries first suggested in 1980 that there would be a compression of morbidity, it was far from clear that there would be, and data to test this idea at a population level were limited. But since then, however, we do have data such as this graph showing estimates taken from something known as the National Long-Term Care Survey, taken from your reading. And there's been a dramatic drop in disability over the last 20 years at roughly the rate of 2% per year. So this is the percent of Americans disabled. This is adjusted for all kinds of pertinent factors. Here's the year, and the fraction disabled has been consistently declining across time, even adjusting for age, sex, and so forth. So we are living longer, we are dying of different things, and we are healthier while we live. All 3 of these things are happening over the last 100 years. Now, when we speak of disability, morbidity, or health, we seem to assume that we all mean the same thing, and that we all know what we mean. But even this seemingly simple thing, defining health, is actually not so simple. And there are a number of ways to define it. One way to define health is to define it simply as the absence of disease. But this standard relies on the failure to detect a disease, and it's a negative definition that relies on instruments to detect disease, and it simply shifts the problem from one of defining health to one of defining disease. So what are some alternatives? Well, another way to define health is the so-called normality standard, which compares people to the population. And this definition is as follows. Diseases of living organisms are internal states which interfere with the normal functioning of these organisms. What is to be considered normal functioning is calculated statistically with respect to an age group of a sex of a species. So in this type of a definition of health, what we do is we plot the distribution of some attribute, and then we draw a line, and we say, okay, anyone to the right of this line is well, anyone to the left of this line is sick. And this is our definition of health. And by this definition, missing a kidney at birth, which probably one or two of you in this room were missing a kidney at birth, or being colorblind, and probably several of you are colorblind, are defined as disease states when you use this perspective and this definition of health. But here's another definition that you might adopt, the so-called adaptation standard. Here, the definition is as follows. The states of health or disease are the expressions of the success or failure experienced by the organism in its efforts to respond adaptively to environmental challenges. And the adaptation standard compares people to their surroundings. It stresses the performance of the organism in its physical, biological, and social environment. And it focuses on the ability of the organism to perform given its situational background and standard circumstances. So this sunburned man, who appears to be also deprived of some IQ points, and to have deliberately done this, is a poor fit for his high sun environment. He might benefit from killing an older sibling. And more to the point, missing a kidney would not be maladaptive or reflective of ill health in this situation. So by this definition, not having a kidney, those of you that only have one kidney, are probably going to have no adverse consequences and live a normal life in every possible regard. Okay? So by this definition, that is not a problem. And again, for example, colorblindness is not a problem by and large. Maybe in a different it would be. Okay? So how we define it would vary. So, in other words, the standard circumstances can vary across time and place and society to society. And as a result, a person with a particular physical or mental constitution may be able to fit in one another. May be judged unhealthy in one place, but not in another. So disability can be seen as a failure of adaptation. Now, if your hip is decrepit, and I replace it with modern technology, I give you a kind of titanium hip with like Teflon-coated plastic components, and it's this incredible invention, and I replace your hip, and you're no longer disabled, fine. But what if instead I give you a motorized wheelchair? Does that also make you undisabled? Does it also make you no longer unhealthy? And if you are deaf, are you unhealthy? And if I give you a hearing aid, does that make you healthy? Can, by that standard, is a deaf person with a hearing aid no longer definable as unhealthy? And actually, one can get quite serious about the sunburn example. Here's what happens when you take a fair-skinned set of people and move them to an environment close to the equator. This shows the incidence of melanoma in countries around the world, and Australia and New Zealand have the highest rates in the world by far of this deadly disease. And the Aboriginal people of Australia do not suffer from melanoma almost at all. So here, Australia leads the world in malignant melanoma, followed by New Zealand, and then on down the list. So it's not just physical aspects of the environment, such as sunlight, that matter. Biological aspects of the environment can also be relevant to this issue of fitness, or fit. By fitness here, I don't mean Darwinian fitness. I mean the extent to which your body is a fit with the environment, therefore allowing us to define health or unhealth in that situation. For example, so it's not just the physical things like sunlight that might matter, biological things might matter. And historically, for example, Native Americans were just fine in terms of their health until their environment changed with the introduction of Europeans and their old world infections. So epidemics of pathogens such as smallpox or measles raged through the population and decimated it. Here is one estimate of the population decline of the Illinois Indians from 1677 to 1765. And there's over a 70% decline in this population in less than 100 years, largely attributable simply to infection. These people were decimated by the change in their environment, this introduction of these old world pathogens. And on the right is a native drawing of a person suffering from smallpox or measles, drawn in 1845. Now, another way of defining health is as follows. In some ways, disease does not exist until we have agreed that it does by perceiving, naming, or responding to it. This social value standard compares people to ideals and ideas. And in fact, you can ask yourself the question, how can we detect disease, define it, or even exist until we detect, define, and name it? Prior to the antibiotic era, having the sequelae of infections such as pockmarked skin were seen as normal and not deemed to reflect any kind of abnormal disease state necessarily. Or hypertension is another example. We did not know about hypertension, people's blood pressure, high blood pressure, until we invented the sphygmomanometer and could measure blood pressure. For thousands of years, nobody had hypertension. Then we invented a device, put it on people's arms, and now our partition people and say, these people sick and these people are not. So missing a kidney or color blindness are only diseases if we say so. And there's also something known as culture-bound syndromes. Culture-bound syndromes comprise several kinds of illness or affliction, all of which are defined as culture-bound in that they do not have a one-to-one correspondence with disorders that are recognized by Western allopathic sort of nosologies or categories of diseases, and that they often have obscure biological origins. And culture-bound syndromes are also special in that they are initially reported as confined to a particular culture or set of related or geographically proximate cultures. And these pose a number of conceptual problems. So for example, in Latin America, there's a disease called susto. And this is an illness attributed to a frightening event that causes the soul to leave the body, leading to symptoms of unhappiness and sickness. That's defined as a disease. Or in Malaysia, there's a disease called koro, which is an episode of sudden and intense anxiety that the penis will recede into the body and possibly cause death as a result. And there can be epidemic outbreaks of koro in Malaysia and in certain parts of Asia. For example, it's called suoyang in China, this condition. And the treatment for this condition consists in assigning a trusted family member the job of holding the penis 24 hours a day to make sure that it doesn't go up and recede into the person's body. So what are we to make of koro in that kind of a situation? But before, it's sort of easy and entertaining to look at susto and koro and think, you know, that's crazy, right? That's wacky, that doesn't make much sense. But actually we can then turn the lens and look on ourselves. For example, back pain in the West. Back pain, there are no objective symptoms or signs of back pain in almost all cases. In fact, we don't recommend x-rays or anything like that anymore for people with back pain because there's really nothing much to see in most of these cases. There are widely varying rates of back pain, and the biological origins are often quite obscure. Or consider anorexia. People in China might look at us and think anorexia is crazy. What anorexia, the definition is the severe restriction of food intake associated with a morbid fear of obesity, and other methods may also be used to lose weight, including excessive exercise and so forth. So whether we define anorexia or koro as an illness or not depends on our cultural frame, right? It's the social standard for defining whether something is an illness. And this is one of the things we mean when we say that a disease is socially constructed, which is an important idea we'll return to later. So to recap, we've considered 4 possible types of definitions of health. The first, the absence of disease, just defines health by reference to its opposite. But this just says that what health is not, and one would still need to need the normality or adaptation or social standard anyway in order to define disease. And to sum up here, the normality standard compares people to the population of their peers, the adaptation standard compares people to their environment, and the social standard compares people to ideals and ideas. And there's one more sort of official definition of health. This is the WHO definition, which is that health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And in fact, there are many other definitions that people have offered, social scientists and physicians and epidemiologists have been offering. Health as happiness. People say, well, health is actually, we're just going to say that it's the same thing as happiness. The welfare theory of health, and so forth. But the reason the definition is important is that it implies obligations when you define health in a particular way, or partition diseases to be disease, not disease, based on your vision of what is health. The reason that's important is that it creates all kinds of obligations. It creates obligations on patients, and on doctors, and on society. And it raises questions about whether health is a personal or communal good. And it also begs questions about how you might measure health. This connection of health to happiness is important, however, for both conceptual and methodological reasons, in part because it's related to the concept of utility. So what is utility? Utility refers to the happiness or satisfaction gained in consuming goods and services, or from being in a certain state. And people are construed as rationally trying to maximize their utility and rationally trying to be as well off as possible. And also, the more utility people have, the less difference an additional amount of utility makes. There's diminishing marginal utility. So if I gave one of you $100, it might mean a lot. If I gave Bill Gates $100, it doesn't mean as much to him. It's not as valuable to him. And similarly, in terms of health, if I gave a very healthy person a little extra health, it might not mean as much as if I gave a very unhealthy person a little extra health. So the healthier you are, the less and less valuable each additional increment of utility is. The more utility you have, the less valuable each additional increment is. Now, measuring utility and happiness is actually quite complicated and tricky. And utility is supposed to be a summary measure of everything we care about. And it's supposed to be an expression of our values. And many social scientists take a very behavioristic view of utility. They say it is a hypothetical construct that accounts for observed choices. In a bit of reasoning that borders on tautology, they sometimes argue that people are rational maximizers of their own utility, and so by definition, whatever people do necessarily maximizes their utility. I don't take this view. Rather, I leave open the possibility that choices do not maximize utility very well at all. I think that judgments are just as important, or at least as relevant, as decisions. So if we really want to understand what it means to be in a particular state, it's not enough to look at the choices people make. We also have to ask people about their judgments about those states. And in fact, oftentimes people may make irrational decisions about their own health care and health outcomes because their judgments are different than their actions. So how do we measure utility or health more generally? Proper research and understanding trends in disability and health and in quality of life requires some kind of specification of what we mean and also how to measure it. So if we're going to go out there, whatever our definition is, and measure health because we want to improve public health, because we want to understand what's been happening for the last 100 years, we have a number of ways we can approach the measurement problem. Well, we could start by something that's very direct and unambiguous, very objective, death. We can measure death rates, just consensus on when someone has died. And we could have the infant mortality rate, the IMR, or life expectancy, or measures like that, which we've already seen. We could use physical measures. We could test people. We could do blood tests and physical tests, or anthropometric examinations, for example. We could have disability measures, sort of people's performance status, how able are they able to do stuff. ADLs means activities of daily living. Grip strength, we could have them sort of go through functional tests. We could ask self-reports. We could ask people, how would you rate your health? And have like a 5-point scale, for example. We could measure symptoms. We could ask people, what are your symptoms? Do you have diarrhea? Are you depressed? And just check boxes like that. We could give vignettes. We could give people kind of nice stories about different health states and have people rate whether they do or do not have something similar. Or we could use 3 other more technical measures, which I'd like to introduce today. They're known as the standard gamble, the time trade-off, and visual analog scales. And the reason this is important is that it begs a certain set of policy and actually philosophical questions. What matters? Are objective or subjective measures important? What if there's an inconsistency between the two? We objectively look at someone and we say, my goodness, this person is in terrible health. And they say, no, my health is fine. And then the other person that we think is in great health says, no, I'm suffering, I'm in horrible health. What if there's an inconsistency between the subjective and objective measures? Should we privilege people's own perspective, or should we privilege the more biological measures? Should we have social or statistical standards? And why should we care? And also there's the whole question of whose values matter. Do we derive assessments of health states from people who have those states or people who do not? Do we ask, for example, what is the value of missing a kidney? Do we ask that question of people who have 2 kidneys or of people who have 1 kidney? Or do we ask the young or the old or the rich or the poor? And it can often matter quite a bit. Consider whether we want to know how bad it is to have to walk with a cane. If I asked you guys that question, how bad is it to walk with a cane, you would give a very different answer than if I asked a group of 80-year-olds. So people might vary in their assessment of the utility of the state depending on their age. Which then begs the question, well, how do we rate walking with a cane? Do we use a panel of young judges or a panel of old judges if we're trying to figure out that value? So here's one way to measure utility, known as the standard gamble. Let's say you want to measure the intrinsic healthiness of some state A, or its utility, its U sub H. Well, you could give people a choice. Would you rather be in state A or in state B? So for example, here you could have this health state that has some unknown utility, and you could then give people a choice. And in this, they could either choose choice A or choice B. If they choose choice A, they're immediately placed in this health state. If they choose choice B, with probability P, they're assigned to perfect health, which is given set to be 1. And with probability 1 minus P, they're put to death immediately. Okay? So now you give people a choice. Would you rather, for example, be blind, or would you rather have a 10% chance of being put to death and a 90% chance of being perfectly healthy and not blind? Do you understand the trade-off? And I say, what would you rather have? And then I vary this probability P. I keep varying it until people become indifferent. You say, yeah, I would take a 1% chance of death in order not to be blind. And that means the utility of the blind, or the disutility, or the utility of the blind state is 0.99 compared to the utility of perfect health, which is set to 1. And in this way, you can elicit from people and then assign values to the healthfulness of all kinds of states. Now, can anyone see any issues with this approach? What would be a problem with doing this? Yeah. Yeah, it's extremely hypothetical, right? So it's a little unclear what it means. Like, do you really understand what you're doing? Would people actually take this gamble? Like, if I actually, it's one thing to ask you hypothetically, it's now say, okay, all right, now you're actually going to be shot if you, depending on what you pick. Would people actually take the gamble? Yeah. Excellent. So another possibility is innumeracy. Is that what you're saying? People aren't very good at making these decisions. So if we go out to a panel of people, even Yale students, and ask them, maybe they are, maybe they're not so good in actually making rational estimates. Other problems with this approach. Any other ideas? Yeah?
People might not really understand the state that they haven't experienced it yet.
Yes.
So a lot of people might be really horrified because I was in a wheelchair, and then I'll talk to people who do live in wheelchairs. It's very expensive to hear them.
Yes. That's exactly right. And that was driven home to me when I was a young doctor in training. I was a postdoc. And we went to an annual meeting, and one of my colleagues from another university had been born with one arm. And on it's a condition called meromelia, on his, I can't remember if it was right or his left arm, he had like a little tiny deformed hand with like a couple of fingers. He had no arm. And we were at the bar that evening, and this guy was a friend, actually wasn't a friend of mine, he was a friend of a friend's. It was a very honest conversation that was taking place with this man. And people were asking what would they pay to avoid to have 2 arms instead of 1 arm. And everyone there that had 2 arms would pay a lot of money to avoid having one of their arms taken away. And when we asked this guy how much he would pay to have an arm given back to him, he said $20. $20 to have an arm restored. And I mean, we were stunned. We said, you must be kidding. That's all you would pay is $20. And he insisted that that's what he would pay. So being in that state may have everything to do with how people do it. And this is highly relevant, as we'll see, when we talk about end-of-life care. Because we talk, for example, about advanced directives. We want people to bind their future selves and say, if I'm in this condition, turn off life support. If I'm paralyzed from the neck down, I don't want. But many people many change their minds. So how can you know what it means to be in that state, or what utility can you assign it in that state? So this throws this whole field into a really substantial kind of epistemological chaos, right? How do we know what we know? Like, how do we know whether or not these states have this or that or this particular value? This actually reminds me of the game. Did you guys ever play that game when you were young? Would you rather game? Would you rather, not take a shower for a whole year and not be able to tell anyone that it was a joke, that you couldn't take a shower? Or would you rather have to enter every room backwards, whenever you went into the room? You guys remember? Raise your hands if you remember this game. Yeah. Okay. So this is the scientific equivalent of the would you rather game, when you get people to make choices between unpleasant or different alternatives. So here's a different way, using the time trade-off method, of also assigning a utility to a health state. Again, measured sort of UH, okay? So we're trying to assess health state, the utility of this health state. And here on the y-axis is health status, with 1, let's say, being perfect health, 0 being death. And then what we do is we say, okay, you could live in perfect health for this amount of time, T1, or you could live in this lesser state of health for some other amount of time, T2. And we vary T2 until people are neutral to the choice. Would you rather live 5 years in perfect health or 8 years on dialysis, right? So I ask you the two. Now clearly you would rather live in 5 years in perfect health than in 4 years on dialysis, right? If this dotted line dropped to the left of T1, then this would dominate. This line would dominate that line. Clearly you'd live longer and in better health. So what we want is we want this to be to the right of this line, and so people have to trade off length of life for quality of life. And by varying the amount of time and doing some simple arithmetic shown in the equation up above, which you don't need to memorize, but you can manipulate these quantities, you can then calculate and back out the value of UH. In principle, because once you get people to be neutral between the two, you claim that the area of these two quadrilaterals or rectangles is the same, and then by equalizing, or by setting them equal to each other, you just solve for and compute the utility of health state H. So here's how it works. You tell someone you are age 50, you tell them you have severe arthritis, which means you're unable to walk and in constant pain, and you must choose between living with arthritis until you're 80 or living in perfect health for a shorter period of time. And then you ping pong back and forth until the amount is chosen and the respondent is neutral. And let's say they say, I would like to live 75 years in perfect health rather than I'd like to be 75 in perfect health rather than 80 with severe arthritis and in constant pain. You plug in 50, 80, and 75 into that equation, and you compute that the utility of arthritis and severe pain is 0.83, okay? And so the better the proposed health state, the fewer years people would be willing to give up. Now, visual analog scales are the third way, and actually, amazingly, one of the simplest ways that performs just as well as these more complicated ways. You give people a little line like this, no pain at all, worst possible pain, and you ask them to rate how bad the state is. No perfect health or bad health. Now, here is being on dialysis. Where would you put it if you did that? And this can be done in a variety of ways. This is the way that's now done. I'm a hospice doctor. We now use this in the hospital setting. You take these little cartoons around to the patient's bedside, and you ask them to rate their pain. And they give you a little rating, and you can quantify that. You can actually get a ruler out and measure the number of millimeters, and that can give you the utility of the state that the patient is in. And here's some illustrative utilities obtained from these types of measures. When you do these types of calculations and you elicit people's utilities, here's what you get. So perfect health is set to 1. Having mild angina, which is sort of heart pain on exertion, people rate that as 0.9. Having been the recipient of a kidney transplant, people rate that as a 0.84. Having severe arthritis, 0.83. Being on lifelong dialysis, 0.59. Now, it's possible one or two of you are on dialysis, and probably you wouldn't think that your life is half as good as a normal, perfectly healthy life. But people not on dialysis, when you ask them to think about, actually you have to go to dialysis 3 times a week. Many of you may not know this, but there are dialysis centers all around the country, often in shopping malls. You've never paid attention. But think about it. If you're traveling and your kidneys don't work, every other day you need to find a place to be dialyzed. So across the whole nation, you can find a place, make an appointment, go in and get dialysis. It's actually quite a challenge. So if you describe to people what that's like who aren't on dialysis, they don't think it's so good, but people on dialysis might have a different opinion. Being depressed, 0.45. Being blind, people think that being blind is a utility of 0.39. So about a third. You lose 2/3 of your quality of life from being blind, according to sighted people. Similarly with deafness, being permanently hospitalized is 0.33, and being dead is set to 0. But one of the things that wasn't foreseen by people as they invented these methods over the last 30 years of quantifying health utilities was that there could be states worse than death. And actually, most of you would agree that there are states worse than death. So for example, being bedbound and in severe pain, or being in a persistent vegetative state. So when you're not dead, but you're not conscious either. These things might be worse than death, in fact, and could potentially have negative scores. Now let's look at one of the ways that these utilities or health measures might be used. So for example, what's the whole point of this exercise? And what foundation does it set for health policy, which we'll get to later in the course? So for example, imagine two patients. Here's one patient, and here's their health state or utility on the y-axis, and time here on the x-axis. Here's the first patient. So his health or her health starts at, let's say, 0.8. They have some kind of insult to their health. At this point, it declines. Another insult here, it declines. And then they kind of drop dead over here. Okay? You can integrate the area under this curve and get the kind of quality-adjusted life years that this person has. The number of years they live times the quality at any given year. Here's a different patient. They have this decrement, they get some medical care, they get better. Oops, a big disaster here, up a little care there, and then they die here. And then you can quantify this person, but if you were comparing their length of life, you would have these two time periods, this period versus this spell, but that doesn't give you as complete a picture as if you compare the areas under the curve. So you can compare the quality adjusted life years of these two individuals. And the quality takes into account both the quantity and the quality of life generated by healthcare interventions. And equality places a weight on time in different health states. So a year of perfect health is worth 1. However, a year of less than perfect health is worth less than 1. And qualities provide a common currency to assess the extent of benefits gained from a variety of interventions in terms of health-related quality of life and survival for the patient. Now, all of the foregoing, everything that I've told you so far, are what might be called thin measures of health. And here's what a thick description, to borrow Clifford Geertz's famous phrase, raise your hands if you've heard this before, thick description, just a few, might be, here's what a thick description of a health state might be, taken from medical anthropologist Arthur Kleiman's work. I'm going to read a couple of papers by Arthur in a couple of weeks. So Alice Alcott is a 46-year-old patient with lifelong diabetes and a new onset of heart disease and angina. And here's how she describes her health state. How was I going to live with this limitation? What a burden I would be on my family and friends. I feared becoming the town invalid. I was terribly guilty. I had felt all along that my illness had interfered with my relationship to my children. I never had enough time to give them. I was more preoccupied with myself than with their problems. I was in the hospital at critical times for them. Now I would be nothing but a burden. As far as my husband goes, the guilt was worse. After the chest pain, I feared having sexual relations with him. We became celibate. The claudication, and that's pain in your legs because of blood vessel constriction in your legs. The claudication, the angina, they interfered with things we loved. Long walks in the country, birding, climbing, sports. I had to become self-centered in order to control my condition. I felt like a survivor. All I was good for was hanging on. This is a completely different description than the quality adjusted life years and the time trade-off and the standard gamble and all that we discussed. You might be well to ask, to what should physicians orient themselves? Should they orient themselves to fixing qualities, or should they orient themselves to this experience, this woman? And there isn't necessarily a right answer. Is the point I'm trying to make. And this is, and notice as well that in this case, like the suicide cases we considered before, this woman is very concerned about her experience of illness insofar as it relates to others. Again, highlighting the kind of social imminence of illness, okay? So she's worried about being a burden to others. She's worried about how it's affecting other people. And this is something that Cutler also describes at page 18 of his book. So this type of a description highlights a good question. Isn't it to this that doctors should orient themselves, taking care of this sort of suffering, rather than to somehow orienting themselves to adjusting the quality level? The final aspect that I would like to note about the state of health in the modern era is that of medicalization, which is a part of the kind of fourth stage of the health transition. And this process of medicalization involves seeing doctors for progressively less serious conditions as time goes by, seeing doctors for non-medical conditions, or the redefinition of such conditions to be under the purview of doctors, or seeing doctors for normal parts of life experience. And in fact, many, if not the majority of outpatient visits that people in this country make to their doctors do not result in a specific diagnosis, let alone in any serious illness being detected. Most of the time in our country, when people see their doctors, there's, quote, nothing wrong with them. Think about that. Most of the time people go to their doctor, there's nothing that the doctor can detect, let alone that the doctor can do for them in the outpatient setting. So people may be healthier by some of the measures that we've been discussing, life expectancy is increasing and so forth, but they may not feel so good about it after all. And people may be healthier on others. So here's a list of some conditions that have recently been medicalized. We understand all of these things increasingly in medical terms, whereas formerly we may have understood them as non-medical problems. Premenstrual syndrome, erectile dysfunction, baldness, short stature and acne, infertility, road rage now is seen as a medical problem, child abuse, substance abuse, gambling, poverty, and gun violence. All of these were things that previously were not seen as medical problems. And now if you suffer from these things, you might wish to see a physician and might be regarded as legitimately seeing a physician if you have these kinds of problems. So formerly, these things may have been understood as different kinds of deviance. They may have been seen as law problems or criminal problems. They may have been seen through the lens of religion as sin or moral failings. And sometimes they may have been seen as medical problems. Yeah? You're asking how would my claim that most of the time people who see doctors, there's nothing wrong with them, if that would still obtain if you exclude regular checkups? Yes. Yeah, it would. Actually, people don't go for regular checkups so much anymore. Do you go for regular checkups? You do? Okay, good. Well, most people don't. And there've been changes in recommendations regarding this. It's a good question. So medical in fact, some of these, in fact, may actually be culture-bound syndromes, right? Road rage, for example, or short stature. We invent the sphygmomanometer, and then we detect blood pressure as being a problem, and then we prescribe medication for it and tell people that they're sick. Maybe we always saw people as short. We could tell the difference between short and tall people, but we didn't see it as a medical problem until we invent growth hormone that can address this short stature. Then we define short stature as being a problem and tell people that they're ill and need to see the doctor if they're extremely short, right? So as we invent technologies and as we have change in our social standards, we can redefine things as being that weren't previously seen as illness as now falling under the category of illness. So medicalization is the progressive annexation of not illness into illness. And as sociologist Renee Fox has put in her terrific essay on this topic, health and illness have come to symbolize many positively and negatively valued biological, physical, social, cultural, and metaphysical phenomena. We use health as a metaphor with which to describe or understand all kinds of other phenomena. And increasingly, health is coming to be seen as a coded way of referring to an ideal state of affairs. And in fact, these medicalized conditions are also a part of the health transition. It may even be the case that as mortality has declined over the last 100 years, and as doctors have in some sense have had less to do, there has been a compensating rise in medicalization, for we still need doctors. So the argument here would be, as we've actually done better at improving the health of the public, we've now created new needs for physicians to meet. Okay, that's it for today. Before I let you go, I want to do a couple things. How many of you came today but didn't come last time? Raise your hands. Okay, so last time's video is online if you'd like to see it. You can either see it at nicholaschristakis.net. Actually, there you can see last year's video. But at CV2, you can see the video from 2 days ago if you'd like to catch up on that. I had one other thing to mention. Are there any questions? Yeah.
This issue with medicalization, is it causing an over-prescription of medication?
Yeah, I think so. I think the fact that we're increasingly prescribing medicines, and we'll come back to that. Ivan Illich makes an incredible argument about how we've medicalized the whole society. 20% of boys are on, ADHD medication, for example. What does that mean? Hold on, before you get all unruly. Another question? Yeah, is there a question here? Someone else? Okay, see you next time.